The Church. The Catholic Church was at the center of the medieval world. Unlike today, it was the only church in Europe, and all Christians belonged to it. With its own laws, lands, and taxes, the church was a powerful institution. It governed almost every aspect of people's lives, from the practical to the spiritual. Most men and women, rich and poor, were baptized and married in church and attended Mass every Sunday of their lives. When they died, their priest read them the last rites, and they were buried on church ground. For many, life on earth was hard and short, but the church said that if they followed the teachings of Christ, they would be rewarded in heaven. This idea gave the church great power over people's hearts and minds. Leaders of men. Archbishops were powerful men who sat on the king's council and played a leading role in government. Bird of blessing. Suspended above the altar, this golden dove symbolized the Holy Spirit during the Eucharist, the Catholic ceremony where bread and wine are blessed and eaten to commemorate the sacrifice of Christ. Censer is suspended on gilded chains. Burning incense is placed inside the censer. Church treasures. By the 14th century, the church had grown hugely wealthy. Money poured in from rents, tithes, page 13, and the sale of indulgences or pardons for sins. Larger churches could afford to buy expensive sacramental vessels like this beautiful 14th century silver chalice. Parish practices. The life of a parish priest was often a hard one. Many were poor men who lacked any serious education. Most of a priest's income came from fees charged for baptisms, above, marriages, and burial services. He also had his own land in the village, called the glebe, where he grew his own food. Apart from preaching, a village priest tended to the sick and poor, and the better educated taught Latin and Bible stories to local boys. Swinging censers. During Mass, priests swung censers full of burning incense to purify the air. People believed that by attending Mass regularly, they would be rewarded by God, and the more Masses, the greater the reward. The wealthy could pay to have the Trento, or 30 Masses, said for them. Visions of hell. The Church thought that when a person died, the good and bad deeds of their life were literally weighed in the balance by God. Their soul was either carried to heaven by angels or dragged off to hell by demons. Hell was a real and terrifying place for people in medieval times, and its torments were pictured in vivid detail in numerous paintings. Carved wooden angels from a medieval church, nave or central hall. Angel holds a tiny church. Angel swings a golden censer. Condemned to the flames. Few people challenged the authority of the church, but those who did were severely punished. People who disagreed with the church teachings were called heretics. They faced being brought to trial in a church court, and under its special laws, could be condemned to be whipped or burned at the stake. The Cathar sect of southern France rejected the beliefs of the Catholic Church with their claims that everything on earth was created by the devil. In 1208, the Pope ordered a crusade against these heretics. Over the next 26 years, thousands of Cathars were tortured and burned in huge bonfires until they had been completely wiped out. Bishop's mitre. Bishops were the local leaders of the church. From their great cathedrals, they ruled over groups of parishes called dioceses. They usually came from noble families and were involved in affairs of state as well as those of the church. Some were pious and learned men, but others were not. One 13th century Italian bishop admitted that he did not believe in Christianity and had only taken the office because of its riches and honors. Vicar of Christ. The Pope was head of the whole church and represented God on earth. This massive gilt ring belonged to Pope Eugenius IV, who ruled from 1431 to 1437. Pictures show the coronation of the Virgin by Christ. 14th century bishop's mitre or hat. Building a cathedral. In the early Middle Ages, large churches were built in the Roman style. They had massive pillars and thick walls to hold up the round arched roofs. As a result, windows were small, and Romanesque churches were sometimes dark and gloomy. By the 12th century, they were too small for the booming population of Europe and for the growing stream of pilgrims, page 42 to 43. There was an explosion of cathedral building, starting in 1140 with the Abbey of Saint Denis near Paris. This was constructed in a startling new style called Gothic, where the weight of the roof rested not on the walls, but on outside supports called buttresses. This allowed walls to be thinner and pierced with tall windows that led the eye heavenward and flooded the cathedral with light. Symphonies in stone. Before 1350, 80 cathedrals were built in France alone. Among the first to use flying buttresses was Reims Cathedral, begun in 1211. Lifting with a Lewis. Medieval stonemasons, page 52 to 53, used lifting devices called Lewises to raise heavy stone blocks. The legs fit into a tapered slot cut into the top of the stone, shown in cross-section above, and the lifting rope is hooked onto the shackle at the top. This small modern Lewis can lift blocks weighing up to a ton. Tapered slot stops the legs sliding out. Shackle. The middle leg fits in last, wedging the other two firmly in place. Windlass, heavy stone blocks raised in a basket. Mortar carrier, mason preparing blocks. Men at work. As the walls rose, masons had to work at greater heights. They stood on precarious wooden scaffolding lashed together with ropes. The stone was lifted up to them by a windlass or hoist attached to a big wheel turned by a man walking inside it. Working conditions were hazardous and there were many deaths. Legs push outward as block is raised so Lewis does not fall out. Legs fit into a round hold. Centerings, or wooden frames, support the flying buttresses during construction. They are removed once the mortar has dried. Centerings are built at ground level, then hoisted into place. Timeless tools. Lewises, like most other masonry tools, pages 52 to 53, have changed little since medieval times. This kind of two-legged level was commonly used in the Middle Ages. Soaring to the sky. Gothic cathedrals were held up by skeletons of stone. The ribs were in the vaulted ceilings, which supported the massive stone-tiled roofs. These ribs of delicate stone rested on pillars and curved up to meet in a junction with a pointed arch. The vaults or spaces between the ribs were filled with a course of smaller stones. This method of building was so strong and light that cathedrals could be made higher than ever before. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, they soared up and up. The choir roof at Beauvais, France, reached a staggering 157 feet, or 48 meters. Let there be light. The tall vertical lines of this 15th century window draw the eye upward, which is why this English late Gothic style is called perpendicular. Delicately carved stone tracery, page 53, supported vast panels of vivid stained glass, pages 34 to 35. Flying force. The other vital bones of a Gothic cathedral skeleton were the buttresses. Stone roofs were so heavy that they pressed the ribbed vaults down onto the pillars and forced them outward. To counteract this, huge buttresses were built onto the outside, pushing inward. However, buttresses could not bear all the weight, especially at the top, where the ribs met the walls. Here, extra flying buttresses curved across the vault, transferring the outward thrust downward. Space between blocks is filled with rubble. Gutter. Flying buttress reinforces the wall. Spout. Early example. The elaborate styles of high Gothic windows evolved from simple 13th century lancets like these. Spitting images. Rainwater was drained off the roof into the gutters and then shot out well clear of the walls through spouts. These spouts were often carved into gargoyles, grotesque faces that appeared to be spitting water. The art of decoration. I am a poor old woman who knows nothing, who cannot read. But in the church I see paradise painted, and hell where the damned broil. These were the words of a 15th century French woman, and they spoke for millions of uneducated people in medieval Europe. For them, cathedrals and churches were not just places of worship, they were picture books and art galleries. The great cathedrals were filled with statues and carvings, painted panels and frescoes, which told stories of saints and biblical characters. Most wonderful of all were the stained glass windows through which light streamed in dazzling brilliant colors. Line of sketch or cartoon. Soldered joints. Icons from the East. The inspiration for Europe's church decorators came from the glittering eastern city of Byzantium, modern-day Istanbul. The sacred picture or icon of Christ glows with gold and rich colors. Icons were revered as holy objects. Hog's hair scrub. Stippler for scraping away highlights once a color wash has been applied. Tracing brush for applying fine lines. Latherkin for smoothing out the lead. Groziers for snipping bits off a glass shape. Flint was used in medieval times. Modern glazier's tool. Glaziers and Groziers. Most glass came to the glass painters or glaziers from countryside kilns. It was already colored, and the glaziers cut and shaped the glass pieces. They could vary the colors by scraping away the surface or painting it. The whole picture. Like a fragile and beautiful jigsaw puzzle, the stained glass pieces are fitted together with the lead. The glass slides into grooves on each side of the lead strips, and the whole assembly is held firm with large horseshoe nails. Finally, the joints between the strips are soldered, and putty is applied to seal in glass. The completed panel is then set with others into the delicate stone tracery, page 53 of a window. The lead will last for over 100 years before it needs replacing. Wicked devil urges on the three gossips. Line of clear glass was known as the white or sacrificial line because it was most likely to be broken when the panel was removed for re-leading. Space left for lead is called the cut line. Cut and painted glass shape. Stories in glass. Stained glass windows were like cartoon strips. Through pictures, they taught religious lessons and the stories of the Bible to those who could not read. This panel depicts three gossiping women with leering devils at their shoulders. The moral is clear: don't speak badly of your neighbors. Cut and colored. In medieval times, the design for a window was drawn onto a board coated with chalk and water. Glass pieces were placed over the design and cut to shape, using a hot iron to score the glass. Final trimming was done by nibbling the edges with a grozier. The details of the picture were painted on with enamel, and the glass was fired to fuse in the paint. An altarpiece is set behind the altar. Lead is soft and can be shaped around the glass quite easily. Large nails hold the jigsaw of glass and lead together before soldering. The lead has grooves along each side into which the glass fits. Charlemagne, page 6, was a renowned Christian king. Beautiful blue. Medieval glassmakers produced colors by adding metallic oxides to the molten glass. The glowing colors they created were named after precious stones: ruby red, emerald green, and sapphire blue. The recipes for different colors were closely guarded secrets, and most have since been lost. The beautiful blue glass in these famous windows at Chartres Cathedral, France, was known as bleu de ciel, heavenly blue. A shining example. Altarpieces usually portrayed great moments from the story of Christ. This altar panel was painted in 1333 for Siena Cathedral, Italy, by Simone Martini and Lippo Memmi. It shows the archangel Gabriel announcing to Mary that she will bear the baby Jesus. The style is much more natural than the stiff and formal design of Byzantine icons. The central figures, glowing against a golden background, are full of graceful movement. Holy Orders. 12th century Celtic monk. We must form a school in the Lord's service, wrote Saint Benedict in the 6th century. He founded a monastery in Monte Cassino in Italy where monks could live, work, and pray together. The monks became known as the Benedictines because they followed Saint Benedict's rule, which instructed them to make 3 vows: of poverty, to own no property; chastity, never to marry; and obedience, to obey the orders of their leaders. Making these vows was a serious undertaking, so Saint Benedict ordered that every novice or newcomer should live in the monastery for a year before committing himself. Once he had made his vows, a novice had the crown of his head shaved in a tonsure and became a brother of the order. In time, monasteries and convents throughout Europe adopted Saint Benedict's rule. No light in the darkness. Saint Benedict's rule allowed for basic comforts, but life in a monastery was never easy. At first, monks were not allowed candles for reading at services. They had to learn all the prayers, psalms, and other forms of worship by heart. Tonsure. Wax copybook. Monks spent a lot of time copying out prayers and psalms by hand. They often wrote on wax tablets with a stylus or scratcher. Copying holy passages was also a way of serving God. St. Bernard, 1090 to 1153, told monks, "Every word you write is a blow that smites the devil." Bone stylus, wax tablet on a horn base. The History Man. Many monks were well educated, and monasteries became centers of learning. Saint Bede, circa 673 to 735, also known as the Venerable Bede, was an English Benedictine monk who devoted his life to writing and scholarship. He wrote books on science, religion, and history, including the great ecclesiastical history of the English nation. Without monks like Bede, we would know much less about the history of the Middle Ages. Out of order. By the 10th century, many religious houses had become too relaxed. The monk below had been placed in the stocks with his mistress as a punishment for an illicit affair. Some French monks thought that the ideas of St. Benedict were being forgotten and formed a new order at Cluny in 910. The Cluniacs tried to follow the strict and simple rules laid down by St. Benedict. Other new orders were the Carthusians, who believed in a life of silent prayer, and the Cistercians, who thought that hard work was the best way to serve God. The Franciscans. St. Francis of Assisi, circa 1182 to 1226, was the son of a rich man, yet he gave away all his possessions to live like one of Christ's disciples. He founded a new order of holy brothers in Italy called Franciscan friars. Instead of living in monasteries, they took the word of God to the people, traveling about preaching and begging for their food. An order of Franciscan nuns was founded by St. Clare, one of St. Francis's followers. Plain rope belt. Bare feet. Linen shift worn underneath the habit. Head warmer. In winter, chilly draughts whistled through the stone corridors and bare cells of a monastery. Only the sick room was always heated. Although the monastic way of life was often harsh, St. Benedict did not believe that monks should sacrifice their health in the service of God. His rule stated that a monk's clothes should be plain but comfortable, and Benedictines were allowed to wear linen coifs such as this one to keep their heads warm. The Cistercians rejected such soft ways. Many of them went barefoot, and some even wore hairy underclothes as a sign of their devotion to God. Paternoster or wooden bead rosary for counting prayers. Eating knife. Warm cloak worn in cold weather. Long woolen habit was supposed to emulate Roman clothing. Benedictines were allowed to wear leather belts. Simple hand-sewn leather shoes. Benedictines did not have to wear sandals. Habit of a lifetime. The oldest and largest of the monastic orders, the Benedictines were known as the Black Monks because of the color of their habits. Each of the new orders formed in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries had its own distinguishing dress. For example, the Cistercians wore rough tunics of undyed wool and became known as the White Monks. Nevertheless, the basic style of the habit has remained the same to this day. Did you know? Fascinating facts. Since clean water was difficult to come by, ale for the poor or wine for the rich was drunk with most meals. Peasants made wine by harvesting ripe grapes, crushing them underfoot, then fermenting the juice. Although wealthy people imported carpets from the East during the Middle Ages, the carpets were too precious to be laid on the floor. Instead, they were draped over tables. The walls of grand houses were hung with tapestries, heavy fabrics, and leather panels, which added color to the rooms, provided insulation against the cold, and displayed the family's wealth. Textiles were an important part of a rich man's bed. Most beds consisted of a rudimentary timber frame hung with opulent drapes that were intended to reflect status as much as to afford privacy and warmth. Seating in early medieval homes consisted mainly of benches built along the walls. At a time when violence was widespread, people had to make sure nobody could sneak up behind them. Town market in autumn after a painting by medieval artist Georg Breu the Elder. Late medieval beds were warmed with long-handled brass pans filled with burning embers from the fire. Occasionally, these pans were also used for smuggling healthy babies into noble ladies' chambers to replace stillborn heirs. Rich people in the Middle Ages wore sumptuous, frequently woolen clothes. Individual garments were sometimes stored in smelly bathrooms, however, to discourage moths. The right to hold a weekly market could only be granted to a town by the king in a document called a charter. Since markets brought trades and prosperity to a growing community, such a charter was of vital importance. Infants' cradles were frequently made from birch wood, which was believed to repel evil spirits. Elderwood, in contrast, was thought to attract them. Blacksmiths played a central role in medieval society since they manufactured and mended every object made of metal, from chains, nails, tools, pots, locks, hinges, and handles to weapons, wagon, fittings, and horseshoe. Peasants were required to hand over some of their produce to the lord of their manor. In addition, they had to give 10% of everything they grew to the village priest. This was called a tithe. Medieval men and women usually slept in the nude, even in winter. One documented marriage contract from the 13th century even forbade a wife from wearing night clothes without her husband's consent. In larger houses, animals were often stabled on the ground floor so their body heat would rise up through the timber floorboards and help warm the main rooms. Another common source of heat was the brazier, a freestanding basket or pot, sometimes on a stand, in which charcoal or coal was burned. Convenient and portable, braziers could also be dangerous since burning charcoal gives off carbon monoxide. Early fireplaces were commonly adorned with images inspired by nature. The one in Queen Eleanor's 13th century chamber at Westminster displayed a figure of winter with a sad countenance and miserable contortions of the body. Slender, shapely legs were considered very masculine in medieval times. To show them off, fashionable men wore close-fitting trousers or short trousers with woolen hose. Tight boots accentuated calves. Henry VII coin. Question: was the structure of a royal court during the medieval era as formal and complex as popular mythology suggests? Answer: in our less regimented age, it's difficult to imagine the rigid and intricate hierarchy that surrounded medieval kings and queens. The bed of Henry VII of England, for example, required a retinue of attendants just to maintain it. There was a gentleman usher to draw the curtains, a groom to carry in fresh straw regularly for the mattress, a squire and yeoman to tie, lay, and test it for concealed weapons, cover it with canvas, a feather bed like a duvet, and perfumed sheets and blankets, and a special squire of the body to anoint the bed with holy water. Any necessary textile repairs were made by designated sewers, curtains were changed by more lowly staff called yeomen, hangers, and running maintenance was undertaken by similarly humble but often quite specialized personnel. Question: how did the criminal justice system work during the Middle Ages? Answer: the local lord would settle disputes within his own manner and decide on the most suitable punishment for each crime. Some offenders would be executed, others would be fined, and those who had committed minor misdemeanors were likely to be sentenced to a period in the stocks or pillories, timber contraptions fitted with holes in which a captive's ankles or stocks or wrists and head or pillories would be locked. These devices were set up in public places, and as part of the punishment, passers-by were encouraged to throw rotten fruit. On the whole, only military and political prisoners were shut away, usually within a large castle. Question: how safe were the streets of a medieval town? Answer: during the day, with the bustle of the crowds and markets, the most common dangers came from pickpockets and dishonest traders. After the sun went down, though, the pitch-dark streets harbored robbers and violent criminals. At dusk, therefore, bells were rung to sound the curfew, the time when, by law, everybody had to be indoors. After this time, night watchmen patrolled the streets with candle lanterns to discourage villains and catch anyone who was out after curfew. French book illustration from about 1206 showing townspeople taunting a woman in pillories. Record breakers. Westminster Abbey, London. Unbroken link. With the exception of Edward V and Edward VIII, who were never crowned, every British monarch since 1066 has been crowned in Westminster Abbey in London. The original building, consecrated in 1065, was demolished, but was largely rebuilt by 1272 and finally completed during the 18th century. London Bridge is going up. The first stone bridge across the River Thames in London was commissioned by Henry II in 1170 and was completed in 1206 after he died. With its drawbridge double row of houses and 140 shops, it soon became one of the world's popular famous bridges and remained the only stone Thames bridge until 1750. Deadly enemy. The biggest killer ever to hit Europe, the Black Death, or bubonic plague, wiped out 25 million people, 1/3 of the total population in 3 years between 1347 and 1350. Potent symbol. One of the most durable product symbols in history has its origins in medieval times. Beers and ales of the day, just like their modern equivalents, varied widely in strength, so their containers were labeled accordingly, X for the weakest, up to XXXX for the most potent. In 1924, an Australian brewery revived the XXXX symbol, which is still widely advertised and recognized today.